Can we trust Dr. Andrew Huberman? I'm Dr. Chad Swanson. I'm an emergency physician, and I'm on a journey to understand and transform our health system. Andrew Huberman is a scientific communicator and really kind of a cultural phenomenon that I wasn't aware of until about 6 months ago. I was researching the science of sleep because as an emergency physician, I work nights and sleep has become more and more important for me. So I stumbled across his podcast, not knowing much about him or his work, and I found them incredibly insightful and useful. So he put a lot of emphasis on bright light in the morning. So for me, the morning is the early afternoon. And so I began more earnestly getting up right out of bed, going outside and doing an exercise routine right when I woke up. And it really helped me to get better sleep and to feel more healthy, and it was very helpful. So I've learned more about Dr. Huberman, and I'm going to pull up his the Wikipedia page for him here. Let me see. I'm trying to do this on two computers with two monitors. And I learned that he was a professor at Stanford Medical School, which was quite impressive to me. He graduated from the University of California, Santa Barbara in psychology, earned a master's degree at the University of California, Berkeley, and then a PhD in neuroscience from UC Davis in 2004. So I was impressed with his credentials. I was very impressed with his ability to communicate complex ideas. He was very charismatic and engaging. So I began to listen to his podcasts and his material occasionally. I learned, I'll continue reading here from his Wikipedia page. From 2011 to 2015, he was an assistant professor of neurobiology at the University of California, San Diego, and then took a faculty position at Stanford University. He has a lab known as the Huberman Lab, and his research has focused on the optic nerve, retinal neurons, so research related to eye physiology at a cellular level. So this all seemed very impressive to me. And from the little I've listened to him, which would be a total of probably a few hours, less than maybe 6 or 8 hours, he seemed to be reasonable and rigorous and intelligent, and that was very refreshing to me. So what I learned is that, let's see here, I'm going to keep reading from his Wikipedia page. In 2023, he was a faculty member at Stanford, and then he started a podcast as well. And as of 2023, his podcast had become the third most popular podcast in the United States on Spotify and the most followed show on Apple Podcasts. In 2023, GQ magazine called it one of the most listened to shows in the world, and his YouTube channel has 5.5 million subscribers, and his Instagram account has 6.4 million. So clearly what we would call an influencer, someone who's having a significant influence on how we as a society view science and health. So as an emergency physician and as someone who's interested in transformational change of our health system, this is important to me as I think about how we as a society learn about health and how we change our behaviors and our areas of focus. So I've advocated for a complex adaptive systems perspective to understanding health systems. And with that perspective, there are emergent phenomena. So phenomena that are often surprising or unanticipated, that emerge from the bottom up And Dr. Huberman would be considered, I think, an emergent phenomenon. So there was no central controller from the government or from society that chose him to be the leading science communicator in the nation. There was a series of events that happened in his life, some of which I'm superficially aware of, but his connections with other people, his experience with COVID, and his knowledge base, his ability to communicate, all converged around and allowed him to be a leading science communicator in the United States and even around the world. So I'm just a little background with me. I'm creating these daily videos to understand and hopefully contribute to or catalyze a conversation around historical change in our health system. I hope to present this information kind of as an informal conversation. So if you could imagine a good friend or a family member who you trust, and you sit down and just have a formal conversation with them about topics related to health systems transformation, and imagine that that person has an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours to do some research on the topic, but is not necessarily an expert on that topic. And that's what I intend to do. So I've spent a few hours listening to podcasts about Andrew Huberman and reading his material, but I am not an expert on him. I'm not an expert on his background or experience. But what I think is helpful and valuable is to consider how just a normal person can decide whether an influencer, someone who has a significant platform and influence, if their message can be trusted. So there are a number of people, and I'll provide links in the description, that have shared concerns about Dr. Huberman. So let me just pull up his website here. So this is his website. And as you can see, he gives talks and interviews people about a variety of topics, from PTSD and love and emotions and hormones and longevity, and then a number of other topics: light exposure, heat exposure, supplementations, neuroplasticity, mental health and addictions, ADHD. So really, people, myself included, have found his approach to these topics valuable. Obviously, he has millions of followers. Fitness and recovery, aging, gut biome, so memory and learning. So a number of topics across a variety of disciplines. And so a question I think we all need to ask ourselves at some level is, how much can we trust the message of people like Dr. Huberman? So one thing that I think is very important is he has listed his disclaimers and disclosures. So as I click on that, he gives a medical disclaimer, and it essentially says that this is not the practice of medicine. He's not a medical doctor. He's a co-founder of a media, and he has a number of sponsors. As we listen to his podcast, there's a number of funders that have funded his podcast. As we click on the sponsors, there are a number of supplement companies. I'm not even sure. Let's see, 3 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So about 15 sponsors, it looks like. And so he is receiving money from a number of different companies, one of which is a supplement company that I'll give a link to in the description as well. So the question obviously is, here is a Stanford professor who is a very good communicator, who is obviously very intelligent, and yet he is also receiving funding from companies and others that could bias and inform and change the direction of his message. So there has been a large amount of scientific study around this idea of bias in medicine. So from the 1840s, when medical schools were influenced by students who had to pay to go to medical school, to physicians who refer to themselves or to others and get a kickback from that money, to money received and gifts received through the pharmaceutical industry. There's been a long history of this relationship of money, influence, and medicine. It seems obvious as I review this evidence. So obvious meaning at least a 95% chance that this funding influences us, number one, or influences us as physicians. So number two, the influence can be and often is subconscious. So we will say that we don't believe that we're being influenced, and yet the evidence shows that we are. And then finally, that this is an influence that is prevalent even in our most respected institutions. So journal editorial boards, there's a phenomenon called publication bias, where only positive studies are published and negative studies are not. And so the recommendations can be skewed. And then leading institutions from Stanford to Harvard to Johns Hopkins are receiving large amounts of money from pharmaceutical companies, device companies, and others. And so my first concern is that communicators like Dr. Huberman can skew their message to view the products that they're receiving money from in a more positive light than the science might suggest, even if it's unconscious. My second concern is that Dr. Huberman might have a number of messages and protocols, and some are supported by strong scientific evidence, maybe around diet or exercise, and others might not, such as around supplementations. And so there can be this mixing of a message with stronger or less strong or no evidence for its support, and the listener has no way of sorting that out. So Dr. Huberman seems to be trying to walk this line or be in both camps of rigorous scientific communication, so by pointing to his credentials as a Stanford professor, while also receiving a significant amount of funding from industry. And it seems that ideally there would be not only a disclosure of the potential conflicts of interest, but a communication in a way that provides the listener with a sense for how strong the evidence is for the recommendation, and the strength of the magnitude of the effect. So let me just give one example. There is a resource that many physicians utilize called UpToDate. It's a resource that I trust, although it is not perfect and not immune to the biases that we're talking about here. But there is at least a systematic approach to the way that this resource provides its information. And this is what it has to say about supplements, which Dr. Huberman is heavily involved with. I'm quoting here: "The vast majority of herbal medicines and dietary supplements do not have strong evidence for efficacy, safety, and or quality, and therefore should not be recommended. Evaluation and regulation of herbal medicines and dietary supplements is generally less stringent than that for prescription medications. In the United States, manufacturers of herbal and dietary supplements are not required to prove efficacy, safety, or quality of a product prior to marketing. Inaccurate labeling of herbs and supplements and their adulteration with active pharmaceuticals or other bioactive agents occurs frequently." And so we have supplements which do not have a strong evidence base, which are mixed with other recommendations, which may, and it doesn't seem, based on my quick review of Dr. Huberman, that that distinction is being made strong enough. So as I take a step back and think about what's going on in the United States right now after COVID and after, given the history of medicine, it really feels like there's a significant maybe crisis of trust and misinformation. And so part of that has to do with our lack of trust within the medical community. So we're guilty, I say broadly, as doctors, physicians, pharmaceutical companies, regulating bodies, we're guilty of many of the things that I'm suggesting that Dr. Huberman is guilty of. And so it is challenging for society to determine where to get information from and who to trust. So what are we to do? First of all, I'm going to give maybe, let's see, 5 recommendations on how to determine if a scientific communicator, if we can trust their message within about an hour. So one is to look at the credentials and degrees. Certainly a degree from Harvard or Johns Hopkins or Stanford or any other leading institution does not at all guarantee that that person does not have a bias, but it is at least a start. The second, I think, is to follow the money. So look and see what the disclosures and disclaimers are. And if they don't provide any, then that might be a red flag. Third is, does this communicator talk in absolutes, or do they speak about scientific studies in conditional? So my understanding is that, or this study suggests that the evidence is strong to support this, and in probabilities. Do they provide a sense for the level of the strength of evidence for their recommendations and the magnitude of their effects as opposed to absolutes? And then finally, do they change their views when there is new or conflicting evidence? If someone is receiving millions of dollars to support a product, it's going to be very challenging for them to change their mind, both from a financial perspective, a tribal loyalty perspective, and a cognitive dissonance kind of personal perspective. It's very hard for us to admit that we were wrong. So it's almost superhuman to perform that. So a few recommendations on a systems level that we can do about this. One is that I think we need more engaged, knowledgeable, and scientific literate consumers. So maybe at least 10% of society needs to take this on and become just a magnitude higher in scientific literacy about the things that I just talked about. Number 2, journal editors and peer reviewers, I think, should not have any conflicts of interest. Number 3, we as a medical and scientific community have to be much better at policing our own. And then 4, I recommend that all pre-medical students be required to major in health systems transformation, and that this idea around what it means to be scientific literate, how we talk about probabilities and limitations and bias, the economics and history and psychology of medicine, all be part of a major so that all physicians and all other health professionals graduate from their health professionals degrees soon with a deep sense for where we are and where we need to be as far as an ideal health system. So a few final thoughts. One is that no one is immune. We're all humans. So the videos that I listen to that critique this, the current state of things, I can identify areas where those people that critique the current state are also guilty of what they're critiquing. In my experience, as I was getting my master's in public health from Johns Hopkins, one of my professors, the class was on bias in scientific knowledge, and the professor was guilty of overstating the claims of a certain scientific claim regarding environmental science or something. And I asked this professor about this claim, and she quickly said, "You're right. I was guilty of that as well." And then finally, the way that I communicate. So I find myself saying things occasionally also that I'm guilty of overstating a certain claim or not providing adequate disclaimers or context to my views. So we all need to get much better at conversation, at identifying our own biases, and calling out others when their positions seem to be overstated. So finally, this can be disconcerting. So as I was listening to one of the videos that I listened to prepare for this, and I'll provide a link by Dr. Jason Fung, I became a little bit disheartened about the current state of things. And I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the scientific method, in theory, is incredibly powerful and has resulted in advances in public health and medicine that have saved millions and millions of lives and has been very successful, despite all of the biases that we've talked about. And the institutions that we have in place, our research institutions, our government institutions, at least are setting up peer review processes and are striving to present data in a way that is factual and dependent on context. So there is a danger of saying all of these are completely corrupt, and so I should listen to someone else who doesn't have those credentials and isn't at least beholden to a community, and that can be even more dangerous. I'd love to know your thoughts. Thank you.